There will be a giant sucking sound going south. This striking prediction was one man's answer to a simple question posed by a voter on live television in 1992. What will you do as president to bring American factory jobs back home? The man speaking was Ross Perot, a self-made Texas billionaire running for president as an independent outsider against both George H.W. Bush and Bill Clinton. Instead of a typical campaign speech, he delivered a stark warning. He precisely identified what would send the work south, named the towns it would empty, and even specified the year the damage would cease. Yet, America signed the deal anyway, and approximately 850,000 of those jobs vanished exactly as he foretold. But what if one man foresaw a national catastrophe, predicted its exact timeline, and named the towns it would devastate, only to be ignored? Some of Perot's predictions that night materialized almost to the year, while others did not. Understanding which is which unravels the full story of what happened to American manufacturing. To comprehend this, we must first journey back to a time when a single factory shift could still secure a man, a house, a car, and a promising future. For 2 decades following the Second World War, the United States produced nearly half of everything manufactured on the entire planet. Half. Emerging from a war that had devastated every rival industrial power, one nation stood as the world's workbench and simply began to build. You could witness this transformation at night in Youngstown, Ohio. The open hearth furnaces of Sheet and Tube and Republic Steel operated 3 shifts a day, casting a permanent low-orange glow across the sky above the Mahoning Valley. The children who grew up beneath that light didn't perceive it as smoke or danger. They had their own term for the glow illuminating the underside of the clouds. They called it weather. 145 kilometers away, in Flint, Michigan, some 80,000 people clocked in at the General Motors complex. A single company employed nearly an entire city. GM didn't just operate in Flint. Its wages filled the diners along Saginaw Street, and its taxes paved the roads its workers drove home on. The town was built around the factory, and the factory was built around the country. In Bethlehem, Pennsylvania, the furnaces of Bethlehem Steel forged the very bones of the modern nation. Bethlehem Steel framed the Golden Gate Bridge and the George Washington Bridge, and it constructed most of the Gray Navy fleet that secured victory in the Second World War. When Americans of a certain age gaze upon the skyline of a great city, a significant portion of what they see originated from that single Pennsylvania valley. What cemented all of this together was a profound bargain. In 1950, General Motors and the United Auto Workers signed an agreement that became known as the Treaty of Detroit. Pensions, healthcare, and wages that increased with productivity were all written down and guaranteed. That single contract, more than any speech or statute, was the cornerstone of the American middle class. The underlying philosophy traced back to Henry Ford and his $5 day. Pay the men on the line enough so they can afford to purchase the very products they build. For a working family, the promise was almost remarkably simple. A high school diploma and a factory floor shift could provide a house, a car, a pension, and a genuine future for their children. No degree, no inheritance, no connections, just the willingness to clock in. And for an entire generation, the country delivered on that promise. You can sense the confidence of that era in a single machine. In April 1964, Ford unveiled the Mustang and sold 22,000 units on its very first day. The factory wages of the post-war boom were funding the suburbs that the same boom was constructing. A nation that could sell 22,000 cars before sundown had every reason to believe it could build anything. This was truly the workshop of the world. So how did it end up a mere museum of itself? How did the country that produced half of what the planet consumed become one that imports almost everything it touches? There was no single catastrophe, no solitary act of betrayal. The decline unfolded slowly, plant by plant, over 3 protracted decades. The first crack appeared in the autumn of 1973. In October 1973, the OPEC oil states declared an embargo, and the price of crude oil quadrupled almost overnight. The extended post-war boom, which had made every promise affordable, concluded in a matter of weeks at the petrol pump. Americans queued for fuel for the first time in living memory, and the easy certainty that the good years would simply continue forever quietly dissolved in those lines. Detroit was caught unprepared. American plants were tooled to construct large, fuel-thirsty, powerful cars. And large and thirsty was suddenly the last thing anyone desired. Into that void drove Toyota, Honda, and Datsun. Small, inexpensive, reliable cars that sipped fuel. For the first time on a significant scale, foreign cars began to penetrate the home market of the country that had invented the moving assembly line. The peak, when it arrived, was understated. In 1979, American manufacturing employment reached its zenith at just under 20 million workers. That was the high water mark. The number has never returned to that level since. Not during any boom, under any president, not once in the 4 decades that followed. The erosion began at the periphery. In trades nobody was closely observing. Textile mills closed their American doors and reopened in Asia. Electronics assembly drifted to Taiwan. Garment production slipped south into Mexico. Each move, viewed in isolation, seemed small and rational, a mere rounding error on someone's balance sheet. Yet, each quietly carried off a town's livelihood. Then, the fundamental logic of the entire economy began to shift. In 1981, President Reagan dismissed more than 11,000 striking air traffic controllers in the PATCO dispute, and organized labor across the country clearly received the message. The ground had shifted. Around the same time, figures like Jack Welch at General Electric began to advocate a new doctrine, in which the act of making things ceased to be the primary objective. Instead, extracting value from the process of making things became the focus. A factory was now valued more as a number to be optimized than as a place where Americans worked. A new term was even emerging for what lay ahead. Sometime in the mid-1980s, on the campaign trail, a phrase entered the national vocabulary: the Rust Belt. A band of rust stretching from Pennsylvania across the Midwest, where the workshop of the world was beginning to corrode from the inside out. By 1992, manufacturing employment had been declining for over a decade, and the towns felt it deep in their bones. In Dallas, Texas, one man had observed this trend for years and believed he possessed a plan to reverse it. He had built one of the great American business empires of the 20th century, funded a private military rescue, and for years had been writing, speaking, and warning that the country was being sold out by its own political class. His name was Ross Perot. In 1992, he embarked on a quest no independent candidate had accomplished in 80 years, to run for president of the United States as a private citizen. Armed with a flip chart and a checkbook, he was convinced he could save American manufacturing, and for one peculiar summer, it appeared he just might. He was a short, blunt, plain-spoken Texan, barely 1.68 meters tall, and underestimating him on sight was the most common error his opponents ever made. In 1962, operating from a modest Dallas office with $1,000 of his wife's savings, he founded a computer services company called Electronic Data Systems. He built it into a giant, and in 1984, he sold a controlling stake to General Motors for $2.5 billion. By the time he ran for president, he was one of the wealthiest men in America, having achieved this by making other companies function properly when their own managers could not. The story that transformed Perot from a rich man into a folk hero unfolded in 1979 in Iran, when the revolution left 2 of his EDS employees stranded in a Tehran prison. Perot did not wait for the State Department. He self-funded a private rescue mission, hired a retired Green Beret colonel named Arthur Bull Simons to lead it, and successfully extracted his people through the chaos of a mob storming the jail, overland to the Turkish border. When one reviews the accounts of that raid, it reads less like a corporate memoir and more like a thriller. And indeed, it became one, the best-selling book, On Wings of Eagles. That single act cemented Perot in the public consciousness as a particular kind of American, the man who takes care of his own, who doesn't wait for permission, who simply gets things done. His politics stemmed directly from that temperament. He believed the country was drowning in federal debt, while its leaders politely averted their gaze, that trade deals were being signed by people who had never bothered to read them, and that Washington had been captured by lobbyists operating a revolving door system. His plan was stark, almost radical: balance the budget, eliminate detrimental trade deals, expel the lobbyists, and run the country like a business determined to survive. The moment opened for him almost by chance. George H.W. Bush had enjoyed roughly 90% approval after the Gulf War, only to watch it plummet as the economy soured beneath him. The strongest Democrats had sat out the election cycle, assuming Bush was unbeatable, and a small state governor named Bill Clinton emerged as their nominee almost by default. The country yearned for an outsider, and the field offered none. So, Perot positioned himself as the outsider. In February 1992, on Larry King Live, when asked if he would run, he delivered the line that launched his entire campaign: "Put me on the ballot in all 50 states and I'll run." He wasn't asking permission, he was daring the country to draft him. And the country accepted the dare, with phone banks and petition drives springing up in states he had never visited, organized by people who had never worked on a campaign in their lives. Then he did something no candidate had ever attempted. He purchased 30 minutes of network airtime and simply spoke to the camera. No crowd, no music, no sound bites, just a straightforward man at a desk with a pointer and a stack of hand-drawn charts, guiding the country through the national debt line by line. Between 10 and 15 million people tuned in to each broadcast, audiences that would humble a modern primetime show, to watch a billionaire explain compound deficits with a laser pointer. 2 decades before anyone had ever heard the word YouTube, Perot had figured out how to communicate directly, bypassing the press and reaching the country's living rooms. And the country, to the astonishment of every professional in Washington, sat still and listened. By June 1992, polls showed him leading both Bush and Clinton, an independent with no party machine, ahead of a sitting president of the United States. This was no fringe candidate. He was the front-runner, and nothing quite like it had ever occurred in modern American history. A warning like the one Perot was about to deliver only endures if someone takes the trouble to record it. Otherwise, it risks being mocked once on live television and quietly filed away as a punchline. The campaign, however, was only just gaining momentum. Then, just as suddenly, he faltered. In July, he abruptly suspended his campaign, and the reasons have been debated ever since. Most likely, it was a combination of criticism he refused to absorb and a temperament ill-suited to sustained political scrutiny. His support plummeted, and many people wrote him off for good. By October, he was back, just in time for the debates. On the 15th of that month, in Richmond, Virginia, at the second presidential debate, structured as a town hall with voters directly asking questions, the discussion shifted to American jobs. That question opened the door. What Perot said next would define the subsequent 30 years of American politics. I'd like to direct my question to Mr. Perot. What will you do as president to open foreign markets to fair competition from American business, and to stop unfair competition here at home from foreign countries, so that we can bring jobs back to the United States? Perot's answer became the defining statement for the next 3 decades of American politics. That's right at the top of my agenda. We've shipped millions of jobs overseas. He identified the problem immediately. But what followed, the part rarely quoted, was the political mechanism he claimed made it inevitable. And, we have a strange situation because we have a process in Washington where after you've served for a while, you cash in, become a foreign lobbyist, make $30,000 a month, then take a leave, work on presidential campaigns, make sure you got good contacts, and then go back out. He wasn't just predicting an economic outcome, he was naming the corruption that would render it impossible to halt. Then he addressed the mechanism itself. To those of you in the audience who are business people, pretty simple. If you're paying $12, $13, $14 an hour for factory workers, and you can move your factory south of the border, pay $1 an hour for labor, have no health care, that's the most expensive single element making a car, have no environmental controls, no pollution controls, and no retirement. He laid out the specific numbers, the 3 structural advantages, the exact economic rationale for why the jobs would leave. Then he delivered the memorable line, "And you don't care about anything but making money. There will be a giant sucking sound going south." But he wasn't finished. He informed the audience that he had personally consulted the architects of NAFTA to inquire how long the damage would persist. I decided I was dumb and didn't understand it, so I called the who's who of the folks who've been around it, and I said, "Why won't everybody go south?" They said, "We'll be disruptive." I said, "For how long?" I finally got them up for 12 to 15 years, and I said, "Well, how does it stop being disruptive?" And that is when their jobs come up from $1 an hour to $6 an hour, and ours go down to $6 an hour, then it's leveled again. But in the meantime, you've wrecked the country with these kinds of deals. The deal in question was the North American Free Trade Agreement, NAFTA. which would knit the United States, Canada, and Mexico into a single market by eliminating tariffs. In 1993, Perot took the fight back to Larry King Live to debate it head-to-head against Vice President Al Gore. It was the last, best chance to stop the agreement on live television before the entire country. Gore won the night on poise and preparation, while Perot appeared prickly and agitated. Momentum swung sharply toward the deal, and the warning began to seem like sour grapes from a man who had already lost one election. That November, NAFTA cleared the House of Representatives by 234 votes to 200, a narrow margin of just 34. On December 8, 1993, President Clinton signed it into law. What the country carried away from that winter was not the warning, it was the promise. NAFTA's proponents repeatedly assured Americans that the deal would create 200,000 brand-new American jobs. That was the figure the public was given as they signed on. Perot had entered a very different number and a very different sound into the record. The next 30 years of hard data would definitively determine which man had been telling the truth. It would not take 30 years to find out. Dissect Perot's warning, and it separates into 5 distinct predictions. Line each one against what actually transpired, and the pattern becomes impossible to ignore. First, the giant sucking sound itself. The Economic Policy Institute estimated the net toll at roughly 850,000 American jobs lost to NAFTA between 1994 and 2013. Compare that to the 200,000 new jobs the country had been promised, and the promise not only failed to materialize, but inverted into a net loss more than 4 times the size of the advertised gain. Second, the wage arbitrage. The $12 to $14 versus $1 per hour gap that Perot outlined on that stage became the engine of the maquiladora boom, the long belt of assembly plants stretching along Mexico's northern border. By the year 2000, over 1 million manufacturing jobs had moved south, following precisely that model. The flow of labor ran downhill at the exact gradient his arithmetic had predicted. Third, the timeline. Perot had stated the disruption would last 12 to 15 years. The most intense period of manufacturing decline, directly linked to the deal, ran from approximately 1994 to 2010, a decade and a half of steady erosion, landing almost exactly within the window he had named to a live television audience. His fourth prediction is where an honest account must pause. He said wages would converge, and in a narrow sense they did, but not in the manner he had envisioned. American factory pay stagnated. On the Mexican side, wages never rose to meet the American worker at all. In December 1994, barely a year after the deal took effect, the peso collapsed in the crisis they called the tequila crisis, and Mexican manufacturing wages fell by roughly a fifth in the subsequent years. Worse, cheap, subsidized American corn flooded across the newly opened border and devastated Mexican small farm agriculture, driving hundreds of thousands of ruined farmers off their land and northward, exacerbating the very migration pressure the deal's proponents had sworn it would relieve. Fifth, the corruption. The revolving door was always Perot's central obsession, and the money in Washington did not diminish after NAFTA passed. Corporate lobbying spending climbed year after year, reaching a record of approximately $3.5 billion in a single year by 2010, with former trade officials smoothly transitioning into private roles, representing the same interests they had recently negotiated against. The machinery he had described did not slow down after his loss. It industrialized. Now, return to the 3 towns, because the abstractions take on human faces there. Youngstown lost around 3/4 of its manufacturing jobs. The mills that had illuminated the sky orange went dark one after another and were never relit. Mahoning County subsequently became as severely afflicted by the opioid crisis as almost any county in America. A place that had once produced steel for the world was reduced within a lifetime to a case study in what happens when the work leaves and nothing arrives to replace it. In Flint, the collapse of General Motors decimated the tax base and hollowed out local government. When the water crisis erupted in 2014, its direct cause was a specific municipal decision to switch water sources without proper corrosion control. But it befell a city already stripped of the funds and expertise that might have detected the mistake before it reached the taps. In Bethlehem, the mill whose steel framed the Golden Gate Bridge is now a casino, the Wind Creek, built into the old works. Slot machines now ring where the open hearths once roared. Here is the part I find most difficult to contemplate. 2 economists, Ann Case and Angus Deaton, assigned the ultimate measure, a name that has since entered common parlance: deaths of despair. Across the counties hit hardest by the collapse, an entire generation of working-class Americans began dying younger than their own parents, from overdoses, from suicide, from alcohol. The forecast one man made on a debate stage in 1992, dismissed at the time as the paranoia of a rich eccentric, had become, 20 years later, a mortality crisis in the very counties he had pointed out. The chart on that stage turned out to be a map. Pause with that thought for a moment, because it represents the true cost, and the rest is merely bookkeeping. A man working the line his father worked, in a town his family had inhabited for 3 generations, watching the work disappear and the diagnosis arrive. That is what the giant sucking sound actually sounded like up close, in a kitchen in Ohio, long after the cameras had departed. By all evidence, the man had been right. Not vaguely, not in spirit, but specifically, arithmetically, town by town, years before the confirming data ever landed. Which leaves one crucial question. If the warning was this accurate, this early, and this public, why did the country wait a quarter of a century to act on it? By the time it did, Perot himself was gone. He died in 2019 at 89, a semi-forgotten figure from a peculiar election most people only half remembered. His ideas, however, did not die with him. Quietly, without anyone standing up to announce it, the positions that had made him a punchline in 1992 gradually hardened into the shared common sense of both major parties. While he lived, he had tried to build a vehicle for these ideas. In 1995, he founded the Reform Party. For a few years, it was a genuine force, even electing a governor in Minnesota. In the run-up to the 2000 election, a New York businessman named Donald Trump explored seeking that party's nomination, then withdrew his effort in February 2000, months before Pat Buchanan secured the nomination uncontested that August. Buchanan campaigned that autumn under 2 words that would echo strangely into the future: America first. Examine the electoral map of 2016, and you can witness Perot's warning finally coming home. Pennsylvania, Michigan, Wisconsin. The industrial states NAFTA had impacted hardest of all, swung on trade skepticism for the first time in a generation, and America First returned to the dead center of national politics, 16 years after Buchanan had carried the phrase for a dying third party. What is most striking is that this shift originated from both directions simultaneously. On the right, candidates campaigned on Perot's trade critique almost verbatim. On the left, populists articulated the same argument, that working people had been sold out by deals their own political class never bothered to explain to them. The critique that had been fringe and third party in 1992 was now mainstream in both major parties, and the towns that had heard the giant sucking sound firsthand were at last voting as though they had. Then the establishment made the most telling move of all. In 2018, NAFTA was torn up and replaced by the USMANA, negotiated and signed by the Trump administration, ratified with broad bipartisan support, and then kept firmly in place by the Biden administration that followed. Whatever else can be said of it, the USMANA represented the political class quietly conceding, without ever quite uttering the words, that Perot had been right. You can trace the entire arc in a single factory. In Lordstown, Ohio, just up the road from Youngstown, General Motors closed its assembly plant in March 2019. An electric vehicle venture, Lordstown Motors, took over the site with much fanfare, only to collapse into bankruptcy by 2023. The electronics giant Foxconn then purchased the plant and operated it underutilized for a few years, pursuing customers that repeatedly went bust, until 2025, when it was sold to a SoftBank-affiliated entity for $375 million to be converted into a plant-building hardware for AI data centers. Blue-collar auto work, traded in one generation for the physical guts of the tech boom, and by 2025 and 2026, the country had adopted a sweeping regime of import tariffs, an approach commentators widely described as the most aggressive since the 1930s. Which brings us back at the very end to the clock Perot set ticking on that stage. He told the country the disruption would run 12 to 15 years, and it did, almost to the year. What he could not put a number on was how long the country would take to even begin responding to him. And the answer was a quarter of a century. 25 years from the warning in 1992 to the first genuine shift in policy around 2017. By then, the disruption he had described was no longer a forecast, it had run its full course and set like concrete. Once you teach a country to stop making things, it takes far longer than a single generation to teach it how again. And the nation is now living inside the very problem its own political class spent 25 years refusing to name. Stand today on the south side of Bethlehem, on the ground where the steelworks once operated. Close your eyes. Hear the open hearths roar and the overhead cranes groan under ladles of molten metal, the shift whistle cutting cleanly across the valley at the change of the watch. Smell the coke smoke and the hot iron on the wind, and see that orange glow on the underside of the clouds. The weather, the children called it. Picture a man walking home from that shift. A man who knows for a fact that this one job will buy his family a house, a car, and a future, and who has no earthly reason to doubt it. Now open your eyes. The furnaces are cold, floodlit, and decorative, and behind them, the slot machines are ringing. We did not lose that shift to some blind law of nature. We were told in plain words on a stage exactly what was coming, and we allowed it to come anyway. A plain-spoken Texas billionaire, barely 1.68 meters tall, stood on a debate stage in 1992 with a hand-drawn chart and told the country in clear language what was coming. He named the deal, he named the timeline, he named the mechanism that would drive it, he named the corruption that would make it inevitable. 15 million people watched, nearly 1 in 5 voted for him, and the country passed the deal anyway. He was right, he was ignored, and the bill came due.